Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We'll give just another minute or two for folks to join, and then we'll start the meeting. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give folks just another minute or two to join, and then we'll go ahead and start the meeting. Okay, looks like we have a good number of folks on the line here, and it's just a little after 1 p.m. Pacific, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Pam Chanel, and I'll be your meeting facilitator for today. And again, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. We're now going to start the public meeting for the draft environmental impact statement for the Western Oregon State Forests Habitat Conservation Plan. I do want to acknowledge that today's meeting is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be part of today's recorded meeting, I'd ask that you please drop from the call at this point. So while many of you have been following the development of the proposed Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan, or HCP, and the Draft Environmental Impact Statement, or Draft EIS, pretty closely, we'd like to go ahead and review the purpose for today's meeting. We'll be providing information on the environmental review process for federal agency decisions on incidental take permits that are associated with the Western Oregon State Forests HCP. We're also here to provide information on the proposed HCP and the draft EIS, which was recently released for public comment. And finally, today is an opportunity to provide verbal public comments on the proposed HCP and the draft EIS via this virtual meeting. We do have a court reporter who will be transcribing your comments. And both verbal comments provided here today and written comments submitted via regulations.gov will be given equal consideration in preparation of the final EIS. The transcribed comments from today's meeting will be uploaded to regulations.gov and will be available for viewing there. Please note that we're not going to be hosting a question and answer session as part of today's meeting. Folks were asked to pre-register as they logged in here. So I do want to go ahead and review the agenda, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can provide verbal public comments, even if you didn't have a chance to pre-register. So we'll spend the first 5 minutes or so reviewing Zoom webinar tips and some basic troubleshooting, and then we'll review how to get into the verbal public comment queue. Now, I do know that some of you had pre-registered to provide an oral comment when you signed up, but even if you didn't pre-register, there's still an opportunity for you to speak as part of today's meeting. And I'll explain how to do that a little bit later in today's call. So as part of today's meeting, we have several presentations from our project partners, including a welcome from Kate Wells, the interim Oregon Coast Branch Chief for NOAA Fisheries. Then Mike Wilson, the Deputy Division Chief of Policy for the Oregon Department of Forestry, or ODF, State Forests, and Cindy Kolomeychuk, the Western Oregon HCP Project Manager for ODF State Forests, will provide an overview on the proposed HCP. And last, Deb Bartley will provide an overview of the draft EIS for this project, with Sarah Rich from Eco Northwest presenting the EIS's socioeconomic and environmental justice analyses. Deb is a consultant to NOAA Fisheries and is leading the environmental review process for this joint team. After the presentations have wrapped up, we'll then move on to our formal verbal public comment section, and we'll have time set aside for 1 hour for verbal public comments. However, we're willing to provide some additional time up to 4 p.m. Pacific if we still have people in the comment queue who would like to speak. If not, we do anticipate wrapping up this meeting at 3 p.m. Pacific. And as part of that, we'll review next steps with all participants. So just a reminder to our public meeting attendees this afternoon, you were muted when you entered the webinar and will remain that way just so that we can make sure we're hearing what everyone else is saying. If you have any logistical issues or challenges with the Zoom webinar platform, please notify our team using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please also note that any comments that are submitted into the chat are not going to be considered official public comments. In order to be considered an official public comment, you must sign up to provide verbal public comments during the meeting or provide written public comments via regulations.gov. And we'll review how to do that a little bit later in the presentation. So as we mentioned previously, we are not going to be doing a question and answer as part of today's meeting. Therefore, please don't submit questions regarding the HCP or the draft EIS into the chat box, as we won't be able to respond to them there. If you're having audio issues, please make sure to check your Zoom audio settings and that you're connected via your device speakers. You can do that by using that check audio settings button on the Zoom webinar platform. If you are having audio issues, you can also join this webinar by phone. And you can do that by calling 1-888-788-0099. You would then type in the webinar ID, which is 869-7514-9889. And the passcode that you will enter is 271390. This webinar is being recorded and will be online on the NOAA Fisheries website within 5 business days. So next, I'd like to review how to provide verbal public comments this afternoon. We anticipate beginning the verbal public comment portion at about 2 p.m., which will be after our presentations today. Each commenter will have up to 3 minutes to provide their comment, and our Zoom webinar host will display a countdown clock to help you keep track of the time. Please note that this time is a strict 3-minute limit. If your comments are going to exceed that 3-minute limit, consider providing written public comments via regulations.gov with the knowledge that verbal comments and written comments will be given equal consideration in development of the final EIS. So participants who indicated that they wanted to provide a comment during pre-registration will be called on first, and they'll be called on in the order in which we received your registration. If you did not pre-register initially, or if you've decided today that you would like to provide a public comment, you can still indicate your desire to do so. When we get to the verbal public comment section of the meeting, we'll instruct you on how to join the verbal public comment queue. And I'll be announcing the order of upcoming commenters, and our Zoom webinar host will also drop in the names of the next several speakers into the chat box so you can keep track of when your turn's coming. When it's your turn to speak, our host will unmute you, and then the countdown timer will begin once you're unmuted. A last quick reminder, if we could, to please remember to keep our comments appropriate and respectful for today's meeting. Next, I'd like to introduce Kate Wells, the Interim Oregon Coast Branch Chief for NOAA Fisheries West Coast Region. Kate?
Thank you, Pam. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's meeting. I am Kate Wells, the Interim Oregon Coast Branch Chief for NOAA Fisheries West Coast Region. And I'll be providing you with a little background and an overview of the steps in the environmental review process. I'd first like to provide some context for what has led up to this point. NOAA Fisheries and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are considering issuing permits that would authorize incidental take of listed species that could occur from ODF's forest and recreation management activities in Western Oregon. Take, as defined under the Endangered Species Act, means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. Incidental take is an unintentional but not unexpected taking. The HCP, a requirement of the permit application process, is ODF's plan to avoid, minimize, and mitigate for take. The proposed issuance of an incidental take permit is considered a federal action under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NOAA Fisheries is the lead federal agency preparing the EIS, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a cooperating agency. The services have roles under the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as under the Federal Endangered Species Act. This figure depicts the steps in these processes with the NEPA process on the left and the ESA process on the right. For NEPA, as the lead agency, NOAA Fisheries has prepared the draft environmental impact statement. As a cooperating agency for NEPA, the Fish and Wildlife Service is providing technical expertise and document review. NOAA Fisheries will review and consider all comments received during the comment period in preparation of the final EIS. And both agencies will prepare records of decision at the conclusion of the EIS process to document their decisions. For the ESA process, both agencies have provided technical assistance to ODF in the development of the HCP. Each agency is responsible for making an incidental take permit decision for the listed species under their jurisdiction. Each agency will also prepare a Section 10 findings and a Section 7 biological opinion. So next, I would like to introduce Mike Wilson and Cindy Kolomachuk with ODF State Forest, who will provide an overview of the proposed HCP.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Michael Wilson, the State Forest Deputy Division Chief of Policy, and I'm joined today by Cindy Kolomachuk, the Project Manager for the Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan. We are here today to provide information on the Western Oregon State Forest HCP. So our presentation today will cover the key points of the project and the HCP itself. This includes the purpose of the HCP components and organization, the geographic area, the covered activities, the covered species, the conservation actions, monitoring and adaptive management, and the planning structure and public engagement for the project. As a public landowner, ODF manages state forests for social, economic, and environmental values. A key component of this mission includes providing habitat for native fish and wildlife species, including species that are listed as threatened or endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. As a result, ODF is also required to comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act prohibitions regarding take of these listed species. Multiple listed species that occur on state forests managed by ODF, including northern spotted owls, marbled murrelets, coastal martin, and several species of salmon. ODF currently manages state forests consistent with its forest management plans with an intent to avoid and minimize the risk of take of any listed species. This involves surveying around management activities such as timber harvest operations and providing site-specific habitat protections where individuals of a listed species are found. This process is costly and introduces considerable uncertainty and inefficiency when implementing management activities. There are drawbacks to the current approach from the conservation perspective as well. While site-specific measures do serve to protect individuals of a species, it prevents long-term planning for habitat goals, resulting in landscape conditions that are often suboptimal for the species overall. As Kate Wells stated in her presentation, HCPs such as this one offer an approach that balances ODF's conservation and other management objectives in a thoughtful way that dramatically reduces uncertainty and provides assurances for both species and management. This slide shows the document outline for the HCP, which includes an executive summary, chapters 1 and 2, the introduction and environmental setting, which provide context for the HCP. Chapter 3 details the covered activities that may cause incidental take for which ODF is seeking coverage. Chapter 4 details conservation strategies, including biological goals and objectives and specific conservation actions for the covered species. The effects analysis in Chapter 5 estimates the level of take associated with harvest and growth of habitat. Chapter 6 presents the monitoring and adaptive management framework. Chapter 7 addresses the assurances provided by the HCP. Chapter 8 describes the implementation of the HCP, and Chapter 9 presents the associated cost and funding. And Chapter 10 describes alternatives to take that were not selected. The HCP permit area covers approximately 640,000 acres of state-owned forest lands west of the crest of the Cascade Mountain Range to the Pacific Ocean and from the Columbia River south to the California border. The majority of these lands, approximately 500,000 acres, are located in the northern coast ranges and the Clatsop and Tillamook state forests. Smaller state forests and scattered parcels are located in the Cascades and coast ranges surrounding the Willamette Valley and in southern Oregon. Under this HCP, ODF is seeking allowances for incidental take that may result from forest management activities. This includes timber harvest, stand management activities, road system management, recreation facilities and infrastructure, and implementation of the conservation actions themselves. This HCP seeks to cover 17 species of fish and wildlife, including 10 fish, 3 amphibians, 2 birds, and 2 mammals. Not all of these species are currently listed as threatened or endangered. These species were included because they have a high likelihood of being listed during the HCP permit term. And other factors involved in their selection is the current state of knowledge about the species, their habitats, and the potential effects of the covered activities. The HCP conservation strategy is based on a solid foundation that clearly shows the benefits to covered species. It defines what the HCP is trying to accomplish through its biological goals and objectives. It includes conservation actions that will be implemented to achieve those objectives. Describes how ODF will track progress through a monitoring program, and determines how ODF will adjust implementation of the HCP through adaptive management. ODF's HCP contains conservation actions to address the covered species. For aquatic species, this includes the establishment of riparian conservation areas, road system management, stream enhancement, and removal of barriers to fish passage. For terrestrial species, this includes the establishment of habitat conservation areas, upland habitat management, retention commitments, and strategic species actions. In addition to these commitments, the HCP establishes a conservation fund to support specific projects such as aquatic and terrestrial habitat restoration, road decommissioning, barred owl control, and other actions. Funding is provided from ODF's share of the timber revenues and is expected to result in approximately $1 million per year. Riparian conservation areas, or RCAs, are no harvest stream buffers that vary in width by stream type as determined by fish presence, their flow duration, that is perennial or seasonal, and stream size. RCAs will benefit covered fish and amphibian species by providing large wood and cool, clean water. An equipment restriction zone on all stream types ensures protection of stream banks and channels and provides for control and proper routing of sediments. Terrestrial species are addressed primarily through the establishment of habitat conservation areas. HCAs were designed and based on a number of factors, including where the covered species are known to occur, areas of suitable habitat and highly suitable habitat that occur or will occur, and habitat connectivity on the landscape. HCAs encompass nearly all suitable habitat and highly suitable habitat now, and nearly all known species occurrences. Conservation within the forest matrix outside of HCAs and RCAs includes species-specific operational restrictions and upland retention strategies for green trees, snags, and downed wood. The total footprint of HCAs and RCAs is approximately 275,000 acres, or 50% of the HCP permit area. 80% of these acres occur in the North Coast, coincident with the distribution of lands managed by ODF. RCA acres and percentages shown here are for the area covered by RCAs outside of HCAs. RCAs cover approximately 12% of the permit area on their own. HCAs, RCAs, and actions taken in the harvest matrix work together to form a robust conservation package. This map shows the conservation strategy on the North Coast portion of the permit area. RCAs are shown in dark green, HCAs in lighter green, and the intervening forest matrix in pink. HCAs vary in size and configuration, providing different amounts of interior habitat and connectivity across the forest. RCAs provide stream protections and support improved riparian and aquatic habitat conditions over time across the permit area. Just under half of the RCAs occur within HCAs, further enhancing overall watershed function in these areas. The HCP contains monitoring provisions for the covered species and a well-defined reporting cycle. Monitoring is focused on both compliance with and effectiveness of the HCP conservation actions. For instance, compliance with RCA designation and management direction and the effectiveness of RCAs is promoting improved habitat conditions. There is a tiered reporting cycle that includes annual, 5-year, and 10-year reporting that addresses monitoring results. This structure is intended to provide a robust accountability under the HCP and will allow for the successful implementation of adaptive management. I will now turn the presentation over to Cindy for an overview of the engagement process during the development of the HCP.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Kolomachuk, and I serve as the project manager for the Western Oregon State Forest HCP. ODF took a collaborative approach in developing the HCP. We began by engaging state and federal wildlife agencies early in the process to integrate a diversity of technical and policy expertise into the HCP. The scoping team is comprised of technical specialists who advise ODF on the scientific and technical components of the HCP. The steering committee, comprised of agency leadership, reviewed scoping team work products, oversaw the planning process, and worked together to gain alignment among the agencies. The steering committee and scoping teams have been meeting regularly since April 2018 and have invested a great deal of time and resources in the development of the HCP over the last 4 years. The goal of the HCP public engagement process is to provide counties, tribes, stakeholders, and interested parties with equitable opportunities to understand work products and to provide feedback at key points throughout the process. Meetings open to the public were held almost quarterly. To date, we have held 9 of these meetings, which typically draw over 100 attendees. We also met with focus groups and with stakeholders that had concerns or questions between these meetings. We've been engaging local county governments in the development of the HCP as well. This engagement is intended to recognize the distinct relationship between forest trust land counties and state forest lands, ensuring that information relevant to the HCP is provided to counties and giving them opportunities to share their perspectives and provide feedback. And finally, ODF recognizes that the tribes of Oregon are the original stewards of the lands that we currently manage. And we met with tribal governments that had an interest in the HCP to integrate their feedback and identify partnership opportunities for HCP implementation. And now I will turn it back over to Pam. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you, Michael, for your presentation as well. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Deb Bartley, the EIS project manager. Deb?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Pam. Good afternoon. I am Deb Bartley. I'm with ICF, and I have led the NEPA team in preparation of the Draft EIS for NOAA Fisheries. And I'm going to walk through the elements of the Draft EIS process and document, including alternatives and analysis of effects on the environment. And Sarah Rich from Eco Northwest, who led the economics and environmental justice analyses, will be presenting slides on those resource areas. There is a lot of information in the EIS, so we've done our best here to distill what's presented to some of the key information and findings, and to point to where they're further explored in the EIS document itself. Starting with the big picture, an EIS must address input from the public, tribes, agencies, and stakeholders, purpose and need for the action, a reasonable range of alternatives, and effects of the proposed action and alternatives on the human environment, as well as effects of environmental trends and planned actions. And we'll cover each of these in the following slides. Scoping is the first formal step in the NEPA process. During scoping, the public, tribes, organizations, and agencies assist in the development of the EIS by identifying important issues and information and alternatives to the proposed action that should be considered in the EIS. NOAA Fisheries formally initiated the scoping period on March 8th, 2021 by publishing the Notice of Intent to Prepare an EIS. The public comment period was from March 8th to April 21st, and all comments received during scoping were reviewed and considered in development of alternatives and in scoping analysis of effects in the draft EIS. The scoping report is included as an appendix to the draft EIS, and it provides a summary of issues and information submitted and copies of all comments received, which I will say is one of the reasons the EIS is so long. A lot of that is the scoping comments. The purpose and need of the federal action, which is issuance of incidental take permits to ODF, is to protect the covered species and their habitat while allowing ODF to manage the permit area in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. The need for the federal action is to respond to ODF's request for incidental take permits for the covered species and covered activities as described in the HCP. In addition to the proposed action and the no action alternative, excuse me, an EIS must consider a reasonable range of alternative courses of action that meet the purpose and need, are technically and economically feasible, and meet the goals of the applicant, in this case, ODF. NOAA Fisheries conducted a rigorous alternative screening process based on federal implementing regulations. And this process and its outcomes are presented in a screening report that's also appended to the EIS. As part of this process, NOAA Fisheries consulted with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ODF for their expertise and input on technical issues, but ultimately NOAA Fisheries was responsible for making the decision about which alternatives were analyzed in detail in the EIS. 17 potential alternatives were screened, including alternatives suggested in scoping comments. In cases where a suggested alternative was not described in enough detail to properly evaluate and screen, NOAA Fisheries attempted to define it more fully based on their best understanding of the commenter's intent. In some cases where an alternative did not pass the screening, elements of that alternative were moved forward in the alternatives analyzed in the EIS. And based on the screening, 3 alternatives in addition to the proposed action and no action were included for detailed study in the EIS, and I'll describe each of these alternatives in the coming slides. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative. Under the no action alternative, the services would not issue incidental take permits to ODF for the proposed covered activities, and ODF would continue to implement these activities in the absence of the HCP and would continue to be subject to the Endangered Species Act. Under the no action, it is assumed that ODF would continue to implement these activities consistent with its current forest management plans and the Oregon Forest Practices Act, with an intent to avoid and minimize the risk of take of listed species. Part of this approach involves conducting pre-harvest surveys to determine if areas planned for harvest are occupied by listed species. And as described in the HCP, this management approach has been increasingly costly and disruptive to ODF planning and operations, given the uncertain legal and regulatory landscape, the shifting or expanding species distribution, and the potential for new listed species in the future. And although this approach is not practical over the long term for the reasons described above, and it presents challenges in terms of analysis over the 70-year time frame, analysis of the no action alternative is a requirement under NEPA. Alternative 2 is the proposed action or proposed HCP, which ODF just presented an overview of. To provide a brief review, under the proposed action, the services would issue permits authorizing incidental take of the covered species from the covered activities in the permit area for a 70-year permit term. ODF would implement the proposed HCP, including the conservation strategy and adaptive management and a monitoring program described earlier. The action alternatives 3, 4, and 5 would also include issuance of take permits and implementation of an HCP. The HCP under these alternatives would be the same as the proposed action with the following modifications. Alternative 3, increased conservation, would expand riparian conservation areas on certain stream types. It would extend leaf tree requirements to medium hazard landslide initiation sites likely to deliver to fish-bearing streams. And it would include additional requirements for risk inventory and evaluation of roads and motorized trails. Alternative 4, reduced permit term, would have a 50-year instead of a 70-year permit term. And alternative 5, increased timber harvest, would reduce the acreage of habitat conservation areas and increase allowable harvest of Swiss needlecast stands within the habitat conservation areas. The draft EIS analyzes potential impacts of the proposed action and alternatives on the 12 resource areas listed here. In addition, for each resource area, the EIS describes effects of reasonably foreseeable environmental trends and planned actions, including disturbance events and climate change and adjacent management activities. Because all of the alternatives include continuation of ODF's forest and recreation management activities, the types of effects on the human environment are the same under all alternatives. The primary driver of effects is the harvest of forest stands, primarily through clear cutting. Clear cutting has a variety of effects on the natural environment, including removal, modification, and fragmentation of species habitat, increased landslide potential through increased soil instability and compaction and increased runoff, degradation of aquatic species habitat through a reduction in wood available for in-stream recruitment, reduced water quality through increased temperature and sedimentation, and changes in hydrology and channel condition. Harvest also reduces carbon storage potential. Reforestation activities would offset some of these effects over time. In addition to harvest, development of facilities, including roads, quarries, and recreation infrastructure, would also involve removal of trees and other vegetation. And it would have similar effects to harvest, but at a different scale. Harvest and construction would, and as well as maintenance and facility use, would also involve the operation of vehicles and heavy machinery, which can disturb species in their habitat. And these activities would, along with controlled burns, emit pollutants, including greenhouse gases. Although, as noted above, timber harvest and removal of trees and vegetation for facility development would reduce carbon storage, the long-term management of state lands for forestry does provide a substantial source of carbon storage over the analysis period. So although, as described on the previous slide, the types of effects are the same under all alternatives, differences in how these activities are implemented under the alternatives drive differences in these effects in terms of timing, location, magnitude, and duration. Constraints on harvest are a primary driver, and the EIS analyses used ODF's forest management model to understand these differences. This slide summarizes some of the inputs, outputs, and uses of the forest model. Inputs include ODF's stand level inventory, regulatory and operational constraints, management prescriptions, and financial considerations. Forest model outputs include acreages and volumes of timber harvest, revenues and costs associated with timber harvest, forest stand attributes, including age and stand type, and distribution of these attributes across the modeled area, and carbon storage potential. The modeled outputs were used as inputs for EIS analyses, including the following. Modeled harvest projections across the permit area were used to project new road construction and use. forest stand attributes fed into the covered species habitat models, and timber harvest projections were used as inputs for the socioeconomic analyses. A detailed description of the model is presented as an appendix to the draft EIS. A few notes about the model results. First, the results are not meant to be interpreted as harvest targets or to make precise predictions. Second, although the model does reflect past disturbance events and post-disturbance management through 2018, it does not reflect disturbance that has occurred since 2018 or future disturbance. Therefore, these factors were considered outside of the model. And lastly, there are differences in the level of certainty of the no action model compared to the models for the proposed action and the action alternatives. Because the no action model is dependent in part on assumptions for locations of future species occupation, which are unknown, the outputs have less certainty than the models for the proposed action and action alternatives, which are based on specific designated areas that are protected and managed for species objectives for the duration of the permit term. So the no action model, like the no action alternative, has a lot more uncertainty associated with it than the proposed action and the alternatives with the HCP. To give you a general sense of the difference in modeling projections for the proposed action and no action alternative, this slide shows average annual harvest volume in million board feet and average annual clear-cut harvest acreage. No action on the left and proposed action on the right. And again, these are average annual values. Next slide. In the following slides, we'll do a deeper dive into some of the impacts analyzed on the following resource areas. We'll describe effects common to all alternatives and then compare effects under the proposed action and no action. And at the end, we'll touch on key differences in effects under alternatives 3, 4, and 5. First impact we'll look at is how the age and structure of forest stands are projected to change over the analysis period. Based on the forest model results, under all alternatives, average tree age and trunk diameter increase across the permit area. The percentage of mid-seral stands, these include stands in the age range of 30 to 79 years, would decrease, while the percentage of late seral and old growth stands would increase. Late seral stands include those in the range of 80 to 174 years, and old growth include those over 175 years. And in comparing the proposed action and no action model projections, we see mid-seral stands decreasing less under the proposed action and late seral stands increasing less under the proposed action. As noted earlier, under all alternatives, forest and recreation management activities would emit greenhouse gases related to vehicle and equipment use and controlled burns, while forest stands, vegetation, and soils would sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store carbon in the permit area. And while the amounts of quantified emissions and storage differ by alternative, the amount of carbon sequestered is expected to far exceed the amount that covered activities would emit under all alternatives. For covered salmonids, as stated earlier, timber harvest and development of roads and other facilities adversely affect aquatic species through a reduction in wood available for in-stream recruitment, reduced water quality through increased temperature and sedimentation, and changes in hydrology and channel conditioning. Based on the forest management model, harvest and related activities are projected to be greater under the proposed action than no action. Though, as explained earlier, the no action model, like the no action, has greater uncertainty. Though activities are projected to be greater, the proposed action would better minimize and mitigate effects of these activities through implementation of the conservation strategy. First, by establishing wider riparian conservation areas and wider equipment restriction zones, and increasing restrictions on activities in these areas the proposed action would increase large wood recruitment to streams, reduce stream sedimentation, decrease water temperature effects, and improve water quality and food for covered salmonids compared to the no action. In addition, the commitment to a specific number of stream enhancement projects, both over the permit term and by decade, would increase certainty of long-lasting beneficial effects on habitat that would address limiting factors for covered salmonids compared to the no action, which doesn't include this commitment. Additional commitments for removal of fish passage barriers and more stringent design criteria could improve access to habitat for covered salmonids compared to the no action. And finally, committing to monitoring and documenting progress toward implementation of the conservation strategy for aquatic species and achieving the biological goals and objectives for habitat are anticipated to benefit covered salmonids compared to the no action, which does not have similar commitments. Moving on to covered terrestrial species, as stated earlier, the primary effect of forest and recreation management activities under all alternatives is habitat removal and modification. Under the no action alternative, as described earlier, ODF would continue to conduct surveys in advance of harvest to determine if areas planned for harvest are occupied by listed species. If listed species are found during these surveys, ODF would not harvest within a specified distance of determined occupancy. And if the species are found during surveys, harvest would occur. If the species are not found during surveys, harvest would occur, sorry. This approach makes harvest planning less certain and results in harvest occurring in a patchwork across the lands that causes fragmentation of the species habitat over time. It's also important to note that under this approach, habitat is avoided only as long as the species is deemed present, and that protection moves with the species and does not involve long-term habitat conservation. In contrast, under the proposed action, take authorization would increase certainty for harvest planning with designated conservation areas and harvest focused outside of those areas. This certainty flows into the forest model projections, which show increased harvest compared to the no action, and into the related species habitat models, which show some types of covered terrestrial species habitat decreasing compared to the no action projections. However, the HCP would also increase certainty around species habitat conservation and habitat connectivity to sustain the species populations in the permit area in the following ways. First, by establishing large contiguous areas of suitable habitat for the duration of the permit term. Second, by managing those areas for species conservation. Third, by committing to fund and implement strategic efforts to address limiting factors for these species. And fourth, by committing to monitor and document progress toward maintenance and enhancement of habitat over the permit term. In addition to considering the effects of differences in regular or planned activities under the alternatives, the EIS considers the effect of differences in management response to disturbance events, which are anticipated to increase with climate change. There are two main differences in management response to these events: salvage, harvest, and location of protected areas. Under the no action, salvage harvest would continue to be allowed throughout state managed lands, which could delay or prevent habitat recovery after disturbance. Under the proposed action, removal of trees in conservation areas would be limited to what's deemed necessary to protect public safety or facilities, and these restrictions would increase the opportunity for restoration in disturbed areas. In terms of differences in locations of protected areas, under the no action, protection would move with the species. If occupied areas become unoccupied following a disturbance event, they would no longer be protected. And if formerly unoccupied areas become occupied, ODF would avoid activities in these areas. In contrast, under the proposed action, areas of habitat protection and conservation would remain fixed over the permit term, and where disturbance events to affect a large portion of habitat conservation areas, this could be a disadvantage for the species. I will turn it over now to Sarah Rich, who led the socioeconomics and environmental justice analyses, and will discuss effects on those resources.
Thank you, Deb. So the socioeconomic analysis assessed effects both qualitatively and quantitatively. Changes in timber harvest volumes were estimated using the forest model. ODF's log flow data informed harvest volumes to mills. These modeled changes in harvest levels produced changes in employment, income, and government revenue. Employment and income were modeled for the Western Oregon region over the first decade of the permit term using M-Plan. A spatial analysis of modeled harvest allowed us to quantitatively estimate revenues to taxing districts across the permit area and over time. And key informant interviews with county officials and private timber companies were used to validate our model assumptions. Qualitative methods were used to assess changes in non-timber special forest products and other ecosystem services. So, under all alternatives, timber harvest would continue to support local jobs and labor income throughout the analysis period. The sale of standing timber would continue to generate government revenue for state agencies, county governments, and taxing districts. The permit area would continue to provide a variety of ecosystem services, including special forest products and fish and wildlife to support fishing and hunting and other values. It would also create cultural value, create value through carbon sequestration, and would continue to provide habitat for threatened and endangered species and support cultural values. So compared to the no action alternative, the proposed action would increase timber harvest over the permit term across the permit area based on the forest model results. This would result in an increase in revenue and jobs, direct jobs in the permit area over the permit term. These effects vary over time and location. For example, in some cases, values for some local units of analysis in certain time periods may differ from the findings for the permit area as a whole. The modeled impacts on employment and income in the first decade suggest there would be more total employment and income in Western Oregon under the proposed action. Economic impact modeling was not conducted for the entire permit term due to uncertainty in economic conditions and relationships in the longer time span. Local changes in harvest levels and the resulting forest structure would also influence the availability of non-timber forest products and other ecosystem services under the alternatives and over time. So this slide shows a quantitative comparison of the modeled average annual jobs and labor income generated across the permit term in the first decade of analysis. The proposed action produces a higher annual average level of effect than the no action. And the results for the other alternatives are similar to the proposed action, with a small increase for alternative 5 and a small decrease for alternative 3 compared to the proposed action. Alternative 4 would be the same as the proposed action during the modeled time period. This information is a preview of the quantitative results that are available in the EIS, which provides results for direct employment and income and government revenue for all alternatives at different timescales and for different geographies, ranging from counties to the affected taxing districts. So there's a lot more to dig into in the EIS itself. There is also a detailed technical appendix that presents the methodology and assumptions used in the economic models. Now we'll shift to environmental justice. This analysis looks at the disproportionate effects on low income and minority and tribal communities in Western Oregon. Across all alternatives, harvest-related employment, income, and government revenue continue to support and benefit people in these communities. Sustained levels of ecosystem services would support subsistence and cultural value, which these communities disproportionately rely on. Comparing the proposed action to the no action alternative, where reductions in harvest-related government revenue occur in certain time periods and locations, there is overlap with some low-income and minority communities. These reductions, when and where they occur, may adversely affect these communities disproportionately. As changes in forest structure over time and location shift the supply of ecosystem services that support subsistence and cultural importance, it could increase travel costs or lower the value of these resources for some tribes and environmental justice communities. So next, Deb will present some of the key differences and effects under alternatives 3, 4, and 5.
Thanks, Sarah. So far, we've focused on effects common to all alternatives in comparison between the proposed action and no action. And now we'll look at how effects of the action alternatives differ from those of the proposed action. Under alternative 3, most impacts would be similar to the proposed action. However, expanded riparian protections, including increased widths of riparian conservation areas on certain stream types, and more stringent road repair and vacating measures would further improve riparian health and further reduce adverse effects on water quality and habitat for fish and stream-dependent species. And the more stringent road vacating goals could result in reduced public access for recreation and other uses. Under alternative 4, effects would be the same as the proposed action during the first 50 years of the analysis period. Quantitative analysis results are presented in the EIS at this 50-year time interval. Under alternative 5, impacts would also be similar to the proposed action. However, increased timber harvest would increase the potential for adverse effects on water resources and habitat for fish and stream-dependent species. It would decrease modeled habitat up to 5% for covered terrestrial species over the permit term. And it would further increase timber revenue and related economic effects. And that completes our presentation on the draft EIS. Before we move to the public comment portion of the meeting, we just want to review a few next steps. As a final reminder, a video recording of this presentation will be made available online within 5 business days on the NOAA Fisheries website. Requests for post-webinar translation will be accommodated as needed and as requested to Michelle McMullen at NOAA Fisheries. The public review and comment period will end Tuesday, May 17th. Written comments should be submitted via regulations.gov. NOAA Fisheries will review and consider all comments received on the draft EIS and HCP in preparation of the final EIS, which is anticipated to be released in early 2023. And NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service will each issue a record of decision no sooner than 30 days after publication of the final EIS. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also publishing notice of receipt of the permit application from ODF, of their receipt of a permit application from ODF in the Federal Register later this month. And this notice includes a request for comments on the HCP under the docket number on regulations.gov that we will introduce in the coming slides. Although the services are issuing separate noticing, it's completely fine to submit one single set of comments. You do not need to submit 2 separate sets of comments for Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries species. The services will work collaboratively to consider and respond to all comments submitted. And that completes the presentation today. Just up on the screen here are reminders for how to stay up to date on the processes. And I will pass it back over to Pam to lead us into the public comment segment of this meeting.
Hi, my name is Hava Woods. I am taking over for Pam, who had some technical difficulties. Thank you, Deb, for an excellent and thorough review of the draft EIS. We will now be moving into the public comment portion of the meeting. But just before we jump into the verbal comment instructions, we want to review best practices and tips for providing constructive comments, written or verbal. Please submit comments that are clear, concise, and relevant to the project. These are the most effective comments. Please also clearly distinguish between HCP and draft EIS comments. This will help us correlate your comments with the proper document as part of the public review process. Please avoid stating your opposition or support of the HCP and draft EIS or overly broad comments. The purpose of your comments are to help review the plan and improve our analysis in the EIS. Please provide specific references and cite sources or chapters and sections wherever possible. This will help us provide specific responses to your comments. Again, please focus on comments on relevant topic areas: analysis adequacy and clarity, analysis conclusions, ESA and NEPA requirements, the range of EIS alternatives considered, your area of expertise, any perceived errors and omissions. Whether comments are submitted in writing or verbally today, your comment will be given full consideration. Here are some quick instructions on providing written public comments. Please visit the NOAA Fisheries Project website or regulations.gov and enter document ID number NOAA-NMFS-2021-0019-0046. The information should be dropped into the chat. This is the correct location to submit comments on both NOAA Fisheries and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service notices. As a reminder, one set of comments can be submitted in response to both notices. The services will work collaboratively to consider and respond to all public comments submitted on the HCP as well as the Draft EIS. You'll be taken to the Draft EIS page. You may download the document and provide comments through the online platforms. Written public comments will be accepted through Tuesday, May 17th. Before we start taking verbal public comments, just a few quick reminders. Participants who indicated they planned to provide public comment during pre-registration will be called upon first and in order of registration. If you did not pre-register or did not initially request to provide public comment, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. Our Zoom webinar host will add you to the list of participants in the public comment queue. We will call upon this group after we go through pre-registrants. If you are calling in by phone, please press *9 to raise your hand. Please be prepared. When it is your time, we will call on you, and if you are on your computer or device, you will be prompted to unmute. If you are calling on your phone, please use *6 to mute and unmute. Please confirm your name and/or organization affiliation prior to beginning your verbal comments. Each commenter will have 3 minutes, which will begin after you unmute. Our Zoom webinar host will display a countdown clock to assist you. If we have more commenters than we think we can fit into the remaining time, we remind everyone that we can go beyond the 3 p.m. time, but we are going to stop at 2:55 to wrap up and present next steps and then come back to commenting. Okay, I will go ahead and read out the first commenter on our list, as well as identify the next 3 in order of their turn. Our Zoom webinar host will drop their names into the chat box. So just a moment, okay. We have Dave White, John Paul Bowles, and Joseph Powell. Turn it over to Dave now, if you're on.
Dave, please raise your hand if you're here and sign in under a different name. If not, I'll move on to John Paul Bowles.
Okay, if neither Dave White or John Paul Bowles are able to unmute, if you're able to drop something into the chat, we can try to assist you. Otherwise, we can move on to Joseph Powell. Oh, here's John Paul. Hi.
Sorry, everyone. I am quite under the weather. I'm going to pass on my comments today. Thank you for the good work.
Thank you. All right, so next up we have Joseph Powell. Is Joseph available to unmute and provide a comment?
Hova, I do not see Joseph Powell.
Okay, I'll look in the chat here for the names. Okay, who's up next here? Is it Brett Brownscombe? Okay. Is Brett on and able to unmute and provide a comment?
Hello, yeah, this is Brett Brownscombe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I will try to be brief here. So My name is Brett Brownscombe, and I'm providing this testimony on behalf of the Wild Salmon Center, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to conserving wild salmon and steelhead rivers and ecosystems across the Pacific Rim. Oregon's long been the heart of the Wild Salmon Center's programmatic efforts, and Oregon Public State Forests have been part of Wild Salmon Center's core work since our foundation. We're pleased that Department of Forestry and the Board of Forestry have advanced a draft habitat conservation plan, and similarly pleased that NOAA Fisheries is examining a reasonable range of alternatives to compliance with the Endangered Species Act and National Environmental Policy Act. The Wild Salmon Center supports DES Alternative 3, and we will submit more detailed comments as part of the ongoing public comment process. But in short, we feel this alternative offers needed long-term protections for fish and wildlife relevant to ESA compliance. And like the positive elements of Alternative 2, the preferred alternative, Alternative 3 would designate important aquatic and terrestrial habitats on the Tillamook and other state lands, but it would also advance improved steep slope logging protections and attention to the excessive road network impacts without undermining the need for balancing conservation measures with the department's interest in operational viability, including timber harvest. So we feel those additions in Alternative 3 are responsive to conservation needs on the state forest landscape and the Endangered Species Act. If anything, we'd like to see increased attention on the road network, which is, I think, across the forest over 4 miles per square mile, very significant. And in light of climate change and related impacts from flooding and changing hydrographs and precipitation, we feel those threats on roads and steep slopes merit consideration and due analysis. So finally, these Western Oregon state forest lands are situated amidst a sea of industrial timberland clear cuts with often more restricted public access, and have themselves been dominated both historically and today by a timber-centric management approach, especially in areas where surrounding federal public land is sparse or where populations are growing, like in the north coast of Oregon. These state forest lands play an increasingly important role in the landscape for conservation of broader values today, including climate resilience, recreation, and drinking water. So we believe the alternatives analysis should focus more on this surrounding environment context, and that the related effects analysis should be based more on that context, that surrounding context. Finally, dedicated conservation areas and related conservation strategies need to remain robust in nature, continuity, and size, given the relatively fragmented and young condition of these forests today. And we believe Alternative 3 best does this. Thank you for your time and for this public hearing opportunity as well.
Thank you so much for your comment. Our next group of speakers is Laura Wilkinson, Sam Friedman, David Gerhardt, and Robert Main. Laura, if you're available, can you please unmute?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So my name is Laura Wilkinson. I'm the State Forest Policy Director for Hampton Lumber. We own timberlands and operate 4 sawmills in Northwest Oregon and along the North Coast. I first off want to emphasize the need for an extension for the public comment period. The draft EIS and the HCP are complex and excessive in length, and will take longer than the 60 days currently given to do a thorough review and provide meaningful comments on the analysis. Hampton recently signed on to a letter that supports the request from the Oregon Forest Industries Council to extend this comment period an additional 60 days. The primary concerns we have based off our initial review of the draft EIS is around the alternatives and rather the narrowness and incompleteness of them. The 3 alternatives that were selected provide diminutive differentiations from each other in the proposed action. Since graphs weren't even included, we've been inputting the numbers and creating graphs on our own, and you can barely distinguish the alternatives from each other. These are not true alternatives if the outcomes are more or less the same. Secondly, we're alarmed that the proposed action and alternatives are being compared to a misleading no action analysis. The current FMP that ODF is managing under has been a failure in forest management. The state continues to underharvest stands, violating the obligation they have to rural communities. This EIS should at the least include an alternative that shows the harvest and habitat output that state forests could provide under current state and federal laws, excluding restrictions in the current FMP. That would give an accurate reading of how this HCP compares to the true outputs of the land. Another concern is the inadequate socioeconomic analysis. We're still analyzing the specifics included in the report, but the report does not include complete direct and indirect economic analysis. At Hampton, we've been able to determine that our 2 sawmills in the North Coast each generate about $100 million in economic activity in their respective counties. We also know that the stumpage value that we pay when we purchase state timberland sales goes much farther than the payments provided to ODF in the county. Last year, we purchased over 70 million board feet from ODF for just under $30 million, but that generated an additional $40 million in local benefits, including logging, trucking, and mill wages. It also seems like the draft EIS is undervaluing jobs that industry creates. It assumes that only 3 jobs are created per million board feet of harvest, while most organizations would assume 11 to 12 jobs per million board feet are created. This needs to be corrected before the final EIS is complete. Again, we need more time to understand how a 70-year policy will affect industry and rural communities. An extension of the comment period is a reasonable and prudent ask, considering the potential impacts of this entire policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our next commenter is Sam Friedman. Sam Friedman, if you can unmute. And after Sam, we have David Gerhardt and Robert Main. We'll give Sam a second here. Okay, I don't think Sam is on, or he's unable to provide his comment today. Next up is David Gerhardt. Are you available, David? Okay, next on our list is Robert Main. Robert?
Good afternoon. You hear me?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes.
I am Robert Bob Main, Coos County, Oregon County Commissioner. I am the representative for Lane, Douglas, Coos, Josephine, and Klamath counties on the Council of Forest Trust Lands. I formally object to NOAA and the state of Oregon proposing an HCP on county trust lands. In my opinion, neither the state of Oregon nor NOAA have any right to designate any of the county forest trust lands as an HCP. Also, the no action as shown in your presentation, in comparison to the alternatives is faulty. The no action is in court under appeal by the state of Oregon of our $1.1 billion awarded lawsuit for past and future under harvest damages. Therefore, the alternatives as presented are an extreme reduction in harvest and not an increase in harvest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Our next group of speakers is Grant Putnam, Rod Sando, Bob Zyback, and Bob Reese. Grant, are you available to provide your comment? Grant Putnam? Okay, if not, we will move on to Rod Sando.
Hello.
Hi, Rod.
Hi, everyone. I am Rod Sando. I am a science and policy advisor for the Northwest Sport Fishing Industries Association, which is an organization that coordinates the activities of, as you might guess, retail and wholesale businesses in the fishing industry. We strongly support alternative number 3. We think it represents a best alternative for equal balancing of both the fish and economic interests, which is a very difficult task. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. We really appreciate this chance, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you very much for your comment. Next up is Bob Zyback. Bob Zyback, are you available to provide a comment?
Can you hear me now?
Hi, yes.
Okay, I just now got the unmute signal.
Okay.
I'm Bob Zybak, Program Manager for Oregon Websites and Watersheds Project, Inc. Like everybody else in this meeting, I have not read the EIS and HCP because they are 3,000 pages long and they have 3 pages of acronyms. My PhD is in the study of Coast Range wildfire history. It's from Oregon State University. Prior to that, I spent 20 years as a reforestation contractor. I'm widely recognized through my writing and lectures and so on, editorials, for being an expert on Western Oregon wildlife history and reforestation. Nobody has ever contacted me from NOAA or from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I don't know how science is conducted there, but there's been no consultation. And I looked for my specialty, a wildfire, in the doc, and there really isn't anything there. It's just like a disturbance or something. So I downloaded the 2 documents, searched through a PDF file for wildfire, and the first one I came to was the 868 history of fire in Coos County. Information is in error. Last year there was 1879. I wrote a book on this. My dissertation was on it. Accurate information is readily available, and yet the modeling seems to permeate this document, doesn't have factual information. I agree with Hampton and with Bob Main that we need more time. That the federal government should not be in charge of Oregon forests. HCPs, I follow history from day one, have resulted in wildfires, the death of wildlife, no discernible increases in the populations of target species, whether spotted owls or coho. They've been an absolute failure. They ended wildfire, and that's not even accommodated out of the 3,000 pages. They ended pollution. People have died. These events are what created our state forests. So I think, one, we need to do a retrospective study on HCPs in Western Oregon. They've been an absolute failure with unintended consequences that have cost billions of dollars and thousands of rural jobs. Mortality to the wildlife has been unacceptable. Pollution has been bad. This is more government overreach, and it needs to be challenged scientifically, not with modeling. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. Our next set of commenters are Bob Reese, Joseph Urin, and Craig Zarling. And after these speakers, we will open it up to public comments for those who did not pre-register. So Bob Reese, are you available?
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'll keep my comments brief and will submit written comments to greater detail, especially after getting clarification on exactly what we're supposed to be commenting on today. So for purposes of the record, my name is Bob Reese. I'm a 6th generation Oregonian and a professional fishing guide of 31 years. Historically based in Tillamook County, Oregon, now reside in Clackamas County, but still depend on sport fishing as my major source of income. I'm also one of 1,400 fishing guides in the state of Oregon, many of which operate in the Tillamook and Clatsop state forests and waters adjacent to those forests. So obviously this is an important, very important issue to the constituency I represent. I think there's a couple of gaps that need to be identified, and I'll help close those gaps. You guys have created a tremendous body of work here. It's greatly appreciated, the work that has gone into this HCP. We think it's a necessary process in progressing forward, both stable timber harvest as a Tillamook County resident still owning property there, the essential services that are included from funding that's directed from the harvest of those timberlands on the North Coast. It's important to me as a part-time resident there, but even more so as a fish factory. And we've consistently identified fish as a forest product too, one that generates $80 million a year in revenue on the North Coast alone, 1.3 billion in dollars that are already, the last day it was done, I think it was in 2008. So those numbers need to be updated as well. So I think there's just a gross oversight in the value of sport fishing as directly related to forest health. We really only have one species of wild fish that we're still allowed to harvest. When I started guiding back in 1996, we had consumptive access to all 6 runs of salmonids. Now we're down to 1, the fall chinook, and those species are waning as well. So I'm going to, again, be doing a deeper dive analysis of the economics that I believe need to be incorporated in this conversation from a sport fishing perspective, especially given the scope that this DEIS and the HCP covers in Western forest lands. So thank you again for the time to comment. We'll follow up with some additional written comments.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. Our next speaker is Joseph Uren. Joseph, I think you are on your cell phone, so you will need to press *6 to unmute.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name is Joseph Uren. I represent Audubon Society of Lincoln City and Salem Audubon Society. We recognize and applaud the work of our state and federal agencies in developing an HCP for Western Oregon State Forests. We appreciate this opportunity to speak in support of Alternative 3, increased conservation, as described in the Draft EIS. We are strong proponents for integrating protections for all ecosystem services provided by Oregon's public lands, but we're going to limit these comments on the portions of the plan most relevant to terrestrial species. Northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, coastal martin, and eventually red tree voles. The populations are threatened primarily by decades of human activity, resulting in disturbance, destruction, and fragmentation of mature forest habitat. It's our position that conservation actions 6, 7, 8, and 10, as described in the EIS, are absolute minimum standards needed to protect these threatened and endangered species. The establishment of habitat conservation areas of adequate size and contiguity is key to the survival of terrestrial species. Ecologically focused management of these areas to allow them to become mature, diverse forests can and will provide more suitable habitat and a greater opportunity to escape the stressors of human activity. In addition, active management that includes retaining the oldest, largest trees on the landscape during retention harvest can result in patches and stands of old forest necessary to provide refuge and dispersal habitat in areas outside HCAs. We must recognize habitat fragmentation as the disaster that it is on the landscape and actively manage our lands to promote habitat connectivity wherever and whenever possible. It is the need of habitat connectivity that makes alternatives 1 and 5 unacceptable. Business as usual under either the no-take regimen in alternative 1 or issuance of incidental take permits as proposed for alternative 5 have not and will not provide enough high-quality habitat and protective actions needed to prevent the eventual loss of these species. It's the same habitat connectivity that makes alternative 3 better than the original HCP proposal. Strict compliance with the 12 conservation activities upon the landscape described in alternative 3 give us the best opportunity to bring these species back and ensure their survival for the next 70 years. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Our next speaker is Craig Zarling. Craig, if you can unmute, please.
Are you able to hear me now? This is Craig Zarling. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
Good. I did it. Hey, thanks for giving me a chance to comment on this whole very complicated process. I want to comment and support alternative 3 to the HCP. I've lived in Portland for 32 years, and the Tillamook Forest is a pretty important place to me. Most weeks in the winter especially, I'm out there once a week, typically fishing. In fact, the other week I was out and I enjoyed walking along elk trails between my fishing spots. However, I also noticed astonishingly steep slopes where almost a whole mountain seemed to be denuded of all life down to the soil. I would say this is not just an eyesore issue. I think we all know that clear cuts cause so much sediment. And recently in the North Fork of the Wilson, in the past years, there's been a lot of sediment that have come down from the clear cuts in that area. I think that I'm concerned that finances seem to be the only value that gets discussed too often around these issues. And our state forest, the Tillamook Forest included, is a real treasure and needs to be treated as that and not as an industrial agriculture site. It's time to change that. And I think Alternative 3 takes a really good step in doing so. It's produced by both scientific and public input. It provides forest and stream conservation areas. Especially, I think, needed is the steep slope logging change. As a person who spent time in the forest, I've just been impressed and discouraged at how the steep slope logging and the roads really contribute to sedimentation in the rivers. And that option does not exclude logging. It allows for people to make a living in the woods, which I think is a very neat thing. And so I'm just here to advocate for the HCP Alternative 3. And that concludes my comments.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone who registered and provided a comment today. Now we will be opening it up to people who did not pre-register. If you would like to provide a comment today, please drop your name into the chat. Or if you're on the phone, please raise your hand by pressing *9. And we'd also like to take this opportunity to remind people that we are not doing a Q&A during this meeting, but we are accepting additional oral comments from anyone who did not pre-register. Okay, and there are instructions here on the slide for raising your hand or dropping your name into the chat. You press *9 or drop your name into the chat and we will take you in the order that you have requested to speak. We will be on until 3 p.m. today, regardless, but we will watch for hands and also watch for people dropping their names into the chat. Okay, we are staying on even if no one else is providing any comments today. We do not have a whole lot left in our presentation. We have a few closing remarks, and we will be making those. I believe we're waiting until 3, but we may decide to do those a bit early if we have no one else commenting. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and do the wrap-up slides, and we will stay on in case there are people who join late. So we will move on to the wrap-up and next steps. So first of all, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This concludes the verbal comment period of the meetings, unless we receive a note that someone would like to participate or someone raises their hands. We do realize your time is valuable, and we thank you for providing feedback and expertise on the proposed HCP and EIS. In terms of next steps, before we close the comment period of the meeting, we do want to recap that the public review and comment period will end on Tuesday, May 17th. Written public comments can be submitted via regulations.gov. NOAA Fisheries will review and consider all comments received on the draft EIS and HCP in preparation of the final EIS, which is anticipated to be released in early 2023. NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service will each issue a record of decision no sooner than 30 days after the publication of the final EIS. As a final reminder, a video recording of this presentation will be made available online within 5 business days on the NOAA Fisheries website. Requests for post-webinar translation will be accommodated as needed and as requested to Michelle McMullen. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your participation in the meeting today. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be staying online in order to take additional comments or accommodate anyone who joins late.